Good evening and welcome, of course, to Book Passage. This is a special installment of our Race in America, I want to say a panel event, but no, special mini-series event. I'm your host, Paula Farmer. I develop programming for diversity and social justice. In past years, the Race in America special events have been done as a one-night panel event with 4 panelists. But for this year, I decided to do it a little bit differently and actually set up a mini series where for 3 consecutive nights, we have different topics and different authors and activists, and we delve into these different topics. So welcome to night 2. If you missed last night with Kia Corthron and Jen Baker talking about her book and the state of Black literature, you really want to go to our archives. It was a wonderful event, very enlightening. Tonight is going to be a little bit different because we're going to be a little more political here and talking about voter suppression. This is a timely topic, as we all well know, and as we head into the midterm elections and almost weekly bump into news reports about voter suppression and gerrymandering. Please put in the comments in the chat section, your comments and questions. I know you have some. We will get to those later in the discussion in the evening. I'm honored and I feel so lucky to have one of the best people to tackle this topic, Carol Anderson, author of One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression Destroys Our Democracy. And she, with One Person, No Vote, she chronicles a related history to her earlier book, the rollbacks to African-American participation and vote since the 2013 Supreme Court decision that eviscerated the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Carol Anderson is the Charles Howard Cadler Professor of African American Studies at Emory University. Her research focuses on public policy with regard to race, justice, and equality. Her latest book is the second, Race and Guns and a Fatally Unequal America. Steering the discussion is someone equally impressive and who is no stranger to the Book Passage stage. Haney Lopez was one of my first panelists for one of the first Race in America panel discussions in person. So he holds a special place in my heart. And as I remember it, he kind of stole the show. Haney Lopez teaches in the areas of race and constitutional law. He is one of the nation's leading thinkers on how racism has evolved since the civil rights era. His most recent book, Merge Left, Fusing Race and Class, Winning Elections and Saving America, explains how the political manipulation of coded racism has evolved while also offering how to neutralizing political racism. Please, with all that impressive resume, welcome Carol Anderson and Haney Lopez.
Thank you so much, Paula. I'm just going to jump right in. Carol, I'm thrilled to be in conversation with you. You're one of my personal heroes. You're producing these incredible books, White Rage, One Person, No Vote. Now the second is just, and the depth of your insight and the details and the anecdotes. So like one thing we could do is go right into like the accolades and the substance. But I think one of the things that's so wonderful about conversation is, and especially for an audience, is to get a sense of who you are as a person. So let me start with this question, maybe skipping a lot of the sort of the chair that you hold and da-da-da. How would you introduce yourself? How would you introduce yourself?
I am a historian. I am a child of Linden, a pro-Black child from Linden, which is a neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio, that was blockbusted, that was stripped of resources, that was a beautiful neighborhood that devolved into the hood. That's who I am.
Tell me more about that. What is blockbusting? When did this happen?
So when we moved there in the 1960s, the neighborhood was all white. Within 2 years, there was only one white family left. Yeah, and you saw the resources that the city had put in, basic stuff like picking up the trash regularly, like mowing the grass regularly, on city lots. That just, it required, my father was one of those who was always on the phone to City Hall or down at the city council meeting, raising 10 tons worth of hell, going, basically, when are you going to pick up the trash? When are you going to cut this grass? It's too high. And I saw I saw this thing where hardworking folk were having to battle for basic necessities. And I started asking myself, how does this happen? How is it that folks who do everything that they're supposed to do in American society end up just devastated, decimated? How does this happen? And that got me going.
How old were you?
Oh, as a child, so we moved there when I was like 3 or so, and just seeing that neighborhood change so quickly, and then and I grew up there, and so watching it devolve, just.
Wow. So yeah. I'm just trying to think through and of course, I can't get out of my own head as this scholar of race and racism, right? And you're the scholar of race and racism. So you're there as a child, you're 3, you're processing. Like you used the term blockbusting, which, is like there's a racial story there, right? Like people are making money doing this, but at the same time, they're making money off of real racism, real fears. Like, how were you thinking about it? How did your family talk about it?
They really didn't talk about it. But I experienced it. So there was a dentist from the old neighborhood, right? And he was still there. His practice was still there. And I was like, I don't know, 10 or 11 or so. And I went because I needed a filling. And as he's in my mouth, he's like, all of these people moved into our neighborhood and destroyed it. And I'm thinking, Lord, I'm in the middle of Marathon Man, right?
Okay, now that might be generational, but like the scene in Marathon Man where the guy drills his teeth with no anesthesia, I remember that.
right? It's that woo. So you could feel it. You could feel it in terms of there were businesses in the neighborhood, and the businesses, like there was a big auto dealership right there on the corner, and it burned down mysteriously. And when they rebuilt, they didn't rebuild in the neighborhood, they rebuilt out in the suburbs. I mean, it was the grocery store shutting down.
Were you thinking that they maybe set fire to their own business to collect the proceeds and relocate? Maybe. Maybe it's.
Yeah, that was the thought. That was the thought, right? Because when you burn down, you don't rebuild right where you were, but you rebuild way out.
Yeah, you collect that money, you sort of avoid those losses.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, so seeing those changes really led me as a scholar to ask, what's going on here? What are the tectonic plates moving this thing? Why does this look this way?
So did you study race from the outset, like in high school, or not until you got to college, or?
Actually, I started off in international relations.
Interesting. Okay.
And it was in that work in international relations and U.S. foreign policy where I began to see something. And this would become my first book, Eyes Off the Prize, the United Nations and the African American Struggle for Human Rights, because I began to see that in the literature, there was the civil rights literature, there was the decolonization literature, there was the Cold War literature. All of these things are happening at the same time, but these literature bases aren't talking to each other. and they have the same people in there. And I'm like, you know, I know that Truman is not like opening up his skull, popping in his Cold War brain, and then working on Cold War. And then when civil rights, he opens it up and then pops in his Civil War brain and works on civil rights. I know that people are using frames to understand what they're seeing. And so I began to look at that. And that's where I began to look at the power of racism and the power of white supremacy, the power of racial discrimination in terms of shaping policy. And the way that that policy happens emanates both domestically and internationally. And so that's where all of my, how's this happening? What's going on here? That's where it really began to fuse.
So are those the sorts of frames? So again, a white rage, and then one person no vote, and then the second. Across all of those, are there certain frames that keep coming to bear, or have they shifted across the different topics?
Yeah. So what becomes so clear to me, and this really just was like an aha moment when I was writing the second, was the power of anti-blackness.
Mm-hmm.
And that power of anti-blackness, and I'm defining anti-blackness as seeing African Americans as criminals, as a threat to white society, to the white community, as a threat to American democracy. The thing that has to be fought against, chained up, neutralized. The thing that you have to defend against. And so when I think about white rage, where I talk about how you have, every time African Americans make a major advancement towards access to their citizenship rights, you get this massive policy backlash. I know we often think of rage as violence, but I see this bureaucratic violence, not the physical violence, but the bureaucratic violence of Supreme Court decisions that eviscerate the 15th Amendment, eviscerate the 14th Amendment, say that racial segregation is not a badge of servitude of the 13th Amendment, that deals with the force acts, that makes white domestic terrorism basically acceptable, that the federal government can't go after it. So seeing these Supreme Court decisions that do this work, it's also looking at things like massive resistance after the Brown decision, where you have these state legislatures and these governors who are figuring out how to shut down the school systems, how to come up with freedom of choice plans, how to provide state-funded vouchers so that white children can go to all white private academies and there's nothing available for Black children's education. Looking at the way that the war on drugs comes up after the successes of the civil rights movement. And what the war on drugs really does is that with that label of felon, you're able then to circumvent the non-discrimination clauses in the Voting Rights Act, as well as in the Civil Rights Act. And then it was the election of Barack Obama. And with it, we get massive, massive voter suppression. I mean, think about it. It was the Shelby County v. Holder decision, happened in 2013 during Obama's term, after Mitch McConnell was not able to make Obama a one-term president. We see this way of how do we stop all of those folks who came to the polls and put him in place, put this Black man in the White House? How do we make sure that doesn't happen again? And so you see these laws that target the groups that he helped energize and mobilize: African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanics, young, and the poor. And the voter suppression laws, really, that's the hit list there. Yeah. And so I saw it there. And then there's one person, no vote, where I really expand on how voter suppression techniques work, how they're targeted, how they're cloaked in legitimacy to make it look like they're really doing the work of democracy when they're really undermining democracy by basically eviscerating the rights of African Americans and Native Americans and Asian Americans and Latinos, young people, poor people. It's just boom. And then there was the second. And the second really, like I said, revealed to me the power of anti-blackness. Because here you really see it with, we've got to have our guns. We've got to have our guns to protect ourselves. We must have our guns to defend ourselves. There was this one quote: if we are going to have this ferocious monster in our midst, we must keep it in chains. I went, wow, wow.
Where's that quote from? Or
that quote is from the late 1700s or early 1800s out of Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's out of Virginia, early 1800s after Gabriel's revolt. Yeah.
I have a random, like, let me take you to someplace that I think is relevant, but is utterly contemporary. I don't know if you've seen this. I think very few people have, but there's a Louisiana state representative who's recently introduced a new bill to modify Louisiana justifiable homicide statute. Okay, so this is his bill. He's saying, look, in Louisiana, we have this statute that governs justifiable homicide. In plain terms, that would be the statute that includes self-defense. If you think that you're at immediate risk of grievous bodily harm or death, you can respond with lethal force. This is what he wants to add. Let's see, be it enacted, justifiable, a homicide is justifiable, and now he wants to add this language. A homicide is justifiable when committed for the purpose of preventing imminent destruction of property or imminent threat of tumultuous and violent conduct during a riot. This isn't,
Boom!
this isn't like,
Boom!
this isn't like you need to fear for your life. This is, I'm just going to read this again.
Yes.
Homicide is justifiable when committed for the purpose of preventing imminent destruction of property or imminent threat of tumultuous and violent conduct during a riot. And now, just to add a little bit to this, it then goes on to say, for purposes of this paragraph, riot shall have the same meaning as provided in, and then it references this other statute. The other statute said a riot is 3 or more persons who engage in tumultuous and violent conduct. In other words, but now because you've got the word imminent in there, I mean, this, and again, this is proposed, this isn't enacted so far, but as proposed, it says, listen, if I'm out there and I think a riot is imminent, and I get to define tumultuous and violent conduct or imminent destruction of property, I can shoot somebody, and if I kill them, that homicide is justified.
Right. And this is, so you think about this, reminds this is why with the second, I went back to the 17th century to look up all of those slave codes. So this is like the one that says, if there are more than 2 Black people standing together, 2 or 3 Black people standing together, that's a crime. Because, I mean, so you have the right to go up and go, what are you doing? It is that kind of surveillance, that kind of imminent threat. If they're sitting there talking to each other, no good can come of this. That something nefarious is being cooked up, and it's going to be a threat to our safety and to our security. And so this law that's being proposed in Louisiana emanates out of that same nasty root, because you and I both know they're not talking about having 4 LSU students who win the national championship sitting there talking about, woo, we're going to burn this thing down, we're so happy. They're not talking about that.
Well, one time I was giving a talk at University of Florida, Gainesville, on the night of a football victory, and the taxi driver was scared. He's like, we're going to take some back roads, I'm going to drop you off, I got to get home, anything could happen tonight. And I'm like, what? But it's like, people are flipping cars and burning them. Likewise, to be clear, they're not thinking a Trump rally. Exactly. And yet, if we think about the images of these rallies, and especially the sort of the menace towards the press or the menace towards African Americans who are in the audience protesting, violence is imminent.
Right. And we know that that's not the target of this. And so what also is the target of this? You think about this kind of imminent threat. That's what led the McMichaels and Roddy Bryan to hunt down Ahmaud Arbery, and believe that they had the right to stop him. And then they gunned him down and walked away for months under justifiable, where the cops looked at the videotape, 2 DAs looked at the videotape. One DA wrote up a long memo about how this was justifiable homicide. So it is Blackness as threat.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's exactly right. I was so stunned by this proposed law that I took a photo of and I put it on Twitter. And it struck me that many of the people who responded to it on Twitter responded to the property element, that, this sort of like, imminent destruction of property. And they said, oh, this is an egregious example of property being elevated above human life. And it is.
It is.
But I think much more than that, this is about driving a narrative of racial threat. Black people are dangerous. They're at your doors. And I guess I'd add this other thing. It's important that this is not Black person at your door, that Louisiana already has a so-called stand your ground. Like if you're in your house and somebody comes in, you don't need to retreat. You can just kill them, right? Like this is in the context of a protest, right? That turns into a riot. And I think what it's trying to communicate is this sense of like, people who are in the streets demanding racial justice, they don't actually want racial justice. They're dangerous people who want racial revenge. They're a threat to you.
Right. And so it deals with the ongoing narrative that the Black Lives Matter protests were violent and there was all of this looting and the cities were burning. And when you think about Kyle Rittenhouse going to Kenosha, Wisconsin, it was so-called to protect property against all of those Black Lives Matter protesters who were out there. So it is all woven together, the property, protecting the property, the violence, the anti-Blackness, the threat, it's all there.
And when I first saw this, I thought, well, this is the Rittenhouse law, but it's actually way beyond it, right? Like the Rittenhouse law is like, he shows up armed and then says, and then when they tried to take my gun, I felt threatened. And like, that's outrageous enough that he brings this, long gun military weapon. And then when people react as if they're under threat, he says, well, now that you feel threatened, I feel threatened because you feel threatened. So, okay, but this is different. This is way more extreme. This is, I can stand across the street and shoot you all because I think you're about to commit violence.
Exactly. And so the stand your ground law that emerged in 2005 or so out of Florida, that the NRA really helped push through, that stand your ground law expanded on the Castle Doctrine, because that Castle Doctrine said, when you are in your home and somebody comes into your home, you have the right to defend yourself. You have the right to do something to that intruder. But what you don't see, what happens with stand your ground though, is it says anywhere where you have a right to be, then, and if you perceive a threat, you have the right to eliminate that threat.
Sorry. You have to perceive a threat to yourself.
Yes.
What's different with the Louisiana law is you could be down the block. Right? You could be like, hey, look at my brand new assault rifle. It's got 1,000-yard range. I'll stand 1,000 yards away. No threat. Anyway. Let me sort of pivot back a little bit. We got us going on this sort of the violence, anti-Blackness and violence. Let me bring it back to voting for a second.
Yes.
So one person, no vote. It's just a really amazing sort of survey and indictment of different efforts to disenfranchise and frankly, not just disenfranchise, to disenfranchise and thereby degrade and humiliate African Americans, right? There was so much of the thrust of it was like the symbolic message. You don't deserve equality. You don't deserve a voice. You publish it in 2018, 2019, 2020, the big lie. the insurrection. Can you kind of use your thoughts about voting rights and suppression, and talk to us a little bit about how to make sense of Donald Trump's claim that the election was stolen and everything that's happened since, both in terms of a raft of new laws that aimed at disenfranchisement, but also the insurrection?
Yes, so undergirding all of this is the sense that there are people who don't deserve to vote. And so their votes aren't legal. They're illegitimate. They're not real American citizens. And it's because you have this thought process of voting not as a right, but as a privilege that is earned by basically being a conservative white American. And so when you heard Newt Gingrich talking about they stole the election in Philadelphia, they stole the election in Milwaukee, they stole the election in Atlanta. You notice he didn't say they stole the election in Salt Lake City, Utah, right? So he has actually identified cities that have sizable Black populations. And what it was saying was that those Black folks did not have the right to vote. They most certainly did not have the right to vote, to not vote for a white nationalist. How dare they not vote for Trump? How dare they not put this man back in power? How dare they vote him out? That can't be legitimate. And
I was going to say, I wonder about your, don't deserve to vote. But in some ways, the power of your insight about anti-blackness is not merely, they're undeserving. That is that narrative of threat.
Yes, and so this is what you're seeing here. I mean, you got to link it up with Tucker Carlson's replacement theory, right? They're trying to replace us. They're trying to turn us brown. They're taking our culture, and so this is a way to preserve the kind of political power that has been concentrated basically in the hands of white men for centuries. And so with the demographic change that is happening in America, and when you have a political party, the Republicans, who are overwhelmingly white, racialized threat is merged with partisan threat. And so this is where you're getting the they stole it. And because, like with your beautiful dog whistle politics, where the language of criminality and theft is attached to Blackness. So it's not too far of a psychological leap, a cognitive leap, to say they stole it in Philadelphia. Well, Black folks are criminals. Black folks steal. So of course they stole something really precious from good, honest, hardworking white Americans. That is the subtext of what we saw in that insurrection. When they said, we are taking whose house is this? When you saw the Confederate flag being flown in the Capitol, when you saw the anger when they're calling Black police officers the N-word and traitors, this is where you're seeing the explosion of we are physically using our violence, the physical violence, to undo this election, because this election was fraudulent, because you had all of those folks of color voting. Yeah. So that's the fusion. And it was the anger that the voting suppression laws, the closing down of polling places, the voter ID laws, all of those things that had been put in place systematically to depress the vote, that you had incredible grassroots mobilization and organization that really got the vote out by using absentee ballots, for one thing, in the midst of a pandemic. That you had folks like here in Georgia standing in line 5 to 8 to 11 hours in line to vote, saying, I will stand in this line as long as it takes. And so you have all of those voter suppression techniques didn't work. So there was the anger that didn't work. So we tried to stop them. Their organizing and their will overcame all of our efforts to stop them. And then when we tried to put pressure on these Republican legislators to overturn the will of the people, we had folks who were going, no, okay, that's a bridge too far. I'm just not really going to do that. I'm not going to find you 11,790 votes here in Georgia so that you can get the electoral votes in Georgia. I'm not going to do that. Yeah. And so that anger manifested itself in the insurrection, and it manifested itself in the voter suppression laws that followed the insurrection. So what we should have been saying, if we say we're the world's greatest democracy, is that, wow, look at that engagement that we saw. We have never had that many people vote before. And this is in the midst of a pandemic. And they cared enough about this democracy to come out and do the work. We should have been embracing that and looking at what worked and making sure that we could put that in place to keep it, to make it permanent, because it facilitated access to the ballot box. But we didn't do that. Instead, what we saw, state after state after state, how do we shut this thing down? Because,
yeah, let me just pick up on that for a second. One thing I wonder is, what's the relationship between a sort of a grassroots racism and then this sort of top-down strategizing? You know, is there just, yeah, what's the relationship there? What's going on?
I think so. Part of what you see is that with the Southern strategy, so I'm going to do a quick history here. So in '64, when you had the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Southern Democrats, and they had been anti-Republican because Lincoln was a Republican. I mean, so you had to, this is some long, deep history here. Lincoln was a Republican.
Right. So when you said 64, you meant 1864.
No,
we're going to go all the way back to 1864.
Right. So here we have 1964, and you've got these Southern Democrats who are now like, how on earth can we be in a Democratic Party when they're signing up saying they're going to use the power of the federal government to recognize and enforce the civil rights of African Americans? How can I be in this thing? And the Republicans were like, come to me, come to me. And they wooed them in because they thought that what would happen is that they would get all of those congressional representatives, conservative congressional representatives who are now identifying as Republican. And that would allow them to push forward their conservative agenda in Congress. What they didn't calculate on was how toxic pure uncut white supremacy is. It is virulent. You cannot contain it. And so they brought it into the Republican Party, and it moved the party so far to the right that its policies were now, so we've got a chicken and egg thing happening here, is what I'm saying when you're asking about top down and grassroots. So they moved so far to the right that you've now got this really energized base that really wants to hear about your anti-immigration laws. They really want, and your policies. They really want to hear how you don't want all of those Black people getting things that they don't deserve. You want you're getting them, they're the ones who are coming out in the primaries. And so you're seeing then that the candidates are moving so far to the right to be able to speak to that primary base, that base that's going to be there.
Yeah, that to me, that helps me make sense then of the insurrection itself, because it's like the insurrection could not have happened without 50 years of a sort of a cycle of radicalization, right? Like the base is getting more extreme, then the politicians pandering to them, looking to, winning votes through racial demonization get more extreme, and then the base gets more extreme still. And I mean, I'm like watching this and I'm like, I'm actually astounded, but there's all these articles saying, hey, Donald Trump is losing support in the Republican Party. And you kind of see it in the mainstream press. And the implication is, so the party's coming back to the center. But in fact, he is losing a little bit of traction as people shift even further to the right. Like Ron DeSantis is gaining on Trump. Why is he gaining on Trump? Because he's being even more extreme in his anti-immigrant rhetoric and also in his anti-mask rhetoric and anti-vaccine rhetoric. And he's actually pounding Trump for like, you invested in a vaccine,
So, and I look at that 2016 election, right? And here you have 15, 16 Republicans in the primary, many of whom have governing and policy making experience. But who keeps coming to the fore? Mr. Birtherism, Mr. Mexicans are rapists and criminals, Mr. Death penalty to the exonerated five. I mean, Nixon's DOJ finds him guilty of racial discrimination in housing. The man who has no real policies, but has racial invective out the wazoo. As I say, he put a kilo of pure uncut white supremacy on the table and said, snort. And they were like, woo!
What an image. What an image. Let me ask you a different question, kind of related. If the insight is anti-blackness, sort of white supremacy and anti-blackness, can you say something about how anti-blackness helps us that sort of duality, white supremacy and anti-blackness, how that helps us understand the position of other non-white groups, Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans?
Yes, I mean, it's understanding the power of that binary of white and black. And so there was a wonderful book, and I'm sorry I can't remember the author now. This is one of those senior moments, but where she asked the question, how did Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans go from the Chinese Exclusion Act and Japanese internment, I mean, absolute pure vilification, to being the model minority? And what she began to parse out was that they went from being not white in the late 19th century and early to mid 20th century to being not black by the time we get into the 1960s. And so when you have black folks out there in the streets fighting for their civil rights, then you get this narrative of, well, Asian Americans, they value family. Well, they value education. And it was a way to say, and they are quiet, they are respectful. They do everything that you're supposed to do. And it was that going from not white to not black that created this myth of the model minority. And it was a way to pit Asian Americans against African Americans. And this is part of what you're seeing when you're asking, where is that fit? How does that fit? You're also seeing with Hispanics, this same kind of, part of it is that the Hispanics are so varied. There are the Cuban Americans that get this kind of special treatment because of Castro, right? Then there are Mexicans and Mexican Americans who get vilified as invaders. And the same for those who are from Guatemala and from El Salvador. Not so much from Venezuela, or not back in the, but Peru, Venezuela, South America, Argentina. It's a different way. And so it's by fracturing along those fault lines and saying, assimilate, and you too can have the American dream. Assimilate to whiteness and you too can have the American dream. And again, so it's that power of that binary.
Kind of in that way that Toni Morrison talked about, assimilate to whiteness, you can have the American dream, but hey, part of the way you show you've assimilated to whiteness is by giving voice to anti-blackness.
Exactly. And so I think about Noel Ignatiev's book, How the Irish Became White. Because remember, when the Irish came over here, they were pilloried. I mean, just debased, devalued. But what they learned was that the way into whiteness was anti-blackness.
Yeah.
And so how the Irish became white was being staunchly anti-black.
Or out here in California, as the Irish migrated from the East Coast, where they were racial inferiors, to the West Coast, where they claimed a white identity, they did so on the basis of mobilizing against the Chinese. So the rhetoric, and this is Alexander Saxon's work, the rhetoric of the yellow peril is pushed by people who are Irish, who are using it to locate themselves as white. Before we went live, we were having a brief conversation about teaching, and you were saying you had a great day. The students are energized. They're talking about voting rights. Let me try and harness that to this bigger question. How are you feeling about the future? Well, how are your students feeling about the future? I mean, right? Like you're a historian. You compile these devastating sort of sagas of continual anti-Black racism, reinvented, revivified, virulent, lethal. And yet you're like, I had a great day teaching, and the students are optimistic and they're feeling energized. Like, how do you think about the future? How do your students think about the future?
And this is one of those things. We're in this moment, and we have to recognize we're in this moment. One of those white rage moments where that kind of massive turnout in the 2020 election and in the 2021 Georgia runoff that flipped the Senate, and you had a 92% Black voter turnout in that runoff, right? That the response has been all of these voter suppression laws. The response has also been the loosening of gun laws, and where you even have Tennessee talking about anybody's got a gun can really be law enforcement. I mean, just this thing about how do we put these Black folks back under control? And so there's that, but there's also the ongoing organizing, the ongoing refusal to accept this kind of ridiculous domination, this ridiculous kind of structure of what they say a democracy is. There's a vision of a democracy that is vibrant, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious. And then there's that Herrenvolk democracy that you're seeing coming out of the Republicans, where there are basically a strata of whites who control all of the power and give the illusion of a democracy, but in fact, it's not at all.
Let me just clarify the Herrenvolk democracy comment just for the audience. So comes out of South Africa. It's the sense of like a minority population that has democracy amongst themselves, but the majority are subordinated and oppressed. I said all that to my students, and they kind of looked at me blankly. And then I said, well, Herrenvolk translates to master race. It's a master race democracy. Democracy for the master race, oppression for everyone else.
And this is what, and so, one of the things I talked about in White Rage in the updated edition was that when you're trying to understand why you had the difference, Hillary talked about, stronger together, that there were enough resources in the United States where we could all build and grow together. Trump talked about make America great again. And when you asked his folks what that meant, they were like, well, the way we were in the early 1950s, before Brown, the way we were in the early 1900s, before women could vote. So it is this vision of of whites in power before all of these minorities came in and were making claims and getting those claims resonating in this society.
Okay, so this is where I got my little academic smirk on. Okay, dear Professor Historian,
Yes.
you didn't answer my question, because no historian ever wants to, right? Like it's always fun to say to the historian, hey, where do you think we're going? What do you think the future holds? And then to watch them like dodge and dance and like, sorry, but I am genuinely curious.
So, and I think where we really are, and so this is what I'm laying out, we are in the midst of having these massive forces clash.
Yes.
And it is in that clash, we are in the midst of that right now. And it is in the fallout from that clash is how we're going to understand what America is going to be. Are we going to be able to be that multiracial, multi-ethnic, vibrant democracy? Or are we going to be this Herrenvolk democracy? Because the demographic shifts that are happening in America are scaring the bejeebers out of the Tucker Carlsons of this world. And bejeebers is the scholarly term for that.
Yeah. A part of me, like I look at Tucker Carlson and I'm like, Tucker Swanson Carlson, he's fine. He is not actually scared. This is a theater of fear that he as a millionaire performs so that he can pose for a populist base. Yes. Right. But I mean, I don't know. I don't know him, but to me, I look at a lot of these folks and I think the depth of their cynicism, because to connect it up to something you're saying, I think you're so right. If the monster you're unleashing is racial fear, you will not be able to control it. You can't say where that's taken us. So, whether Carlson is a bigot or simply a charlatan, either way, he's unleashing this monster. He's encouraging, he's feeding this monster a racial fear.
And one of the things I wrote this op-ed in The Guardian that said the most destructive force in American history, to American democracy, is white supremacy. But it's not just the presence of white supremacy. It is white supremacy that is not held accountable for the damage that it does.
Oh, see, and I would add, it's the way white supremacy lies around like a loaded weapon that can be picked up. Yep, the Korematsu line, right? That can be picked up by any demagogue who can say, and they may, right? Like we've got these tapes that come out about Nixon or Reagan, and they're like, oh, those guys were racist. But then Bill Clinton, I don't think Bill Clinton was racist. I do think he came to the conclusion that he could use anti-Black rhetoric about crime and welfare to win votes.
Yes, yes. I mean, it was a calculation that after the slaughter of Dukakis, that the Democrats had to move right in order to be able to gain these white voters who weren't really coming anyway.
Yeah, and we're hearing that again, right? And so it's not just move. You said move right, but you could easily have said move white, right? and not just white in this sort of, but white in a very particular way. Yep. Adopt the rhetoric of racial fear being exploited by Republicans, and it's like, to me, I hear the echoes of this right now, where you're hearing people say, Democrats need to make clear that they're utterly opposed to defund the police and want to harden the border and are going to crack down on crime. And I'm like,
and it's like, we've got all this crime. But when you look at the data, it was like how they were hollering crime in the mid 90s. But when you looked at the data in the mid 90s, violent crime had plummeted. But still, you had the political narrative and the media narrative that it was besieging America, that no one was safe, and the face of crime was Black. And it's the same way we're hearing it now. So you're hearing that San Francisco is awash in crime. New York is awash in crime. Atlanta, awash in crime. I mean, a crime. And I'm like, the biggest crime? trying to stage a coup.
Yeah.
And overthrow the government of the United States.
Or earlier you'd said, when you think about the way in which white rage manifests itself, that it doesn't just manifest in terms of sort of spittle-laced invective, but that it manifests in these government policies. And we don't tend to use the word crime, but if you think about government policies that have exposed many people to unnecessary death in a pandemic, to the hardship of lack of access to healthcare, to lack of access to infrastructure, right? Like, there's a tremendous amount of violence that's being done, much more than the violence that politicians are pointing at when they use the language of crime.
And this is what I call that bureaucratic violence, right? So that when you stage it so that there's not access to quality education. So you are pulling hundreds of millions of dollars out of the public school system, while you have all of these children who are coming through an eviscerated school system.
And then you're turning around and you're using a rhetoric to say we can't trust school teachers because they're teaching critical race theory. They're indoctrinating our students. Schools, our public schools, are now being painted as factories of racial hate. Right. And then that racial fear rhetoric becomes yet right. All back to 1954 and Brown versus Board of Education, back to 1864. I'm with you, Carol. You're amazing. I can see Paula. She's going to cut me off any minute now. I just wanted to get that. You're amazing. I wanted to get that in.
Thank you, Ian. Likewise, I'm loving this conversation.
I am too. Trust me. I was like looking at the clock, like, I don't want to go in. I don't want to go in. You two are amazing. Thank you so much. I do want to get at least one or two audience questions in. We have Carol Lee from Wisconsin. She said the latest from Rittenhouse, that he's petitioned Kenosha to get his gun back, and probably will. So the question is, how do we fight against disenfranchising legislation such as that?
You know, and this is where it is so important. I mean, Wisconsin was one of the key states that implemented voter ID, removed polling places from Milwaukee to make driver's license bureaus from Milwaukee to make it much more difficult to get the voter ID. And so it is organizing, mobilizing, getting folks out to vote, to get the people in power. Wisconsin has a horribly gerrymandered setup. Mm-hmm. It is like ballot initiatives so that you can have a commission that can take that drawing of those boundaries out of the hands of these Republicans who applaud the voter suppression.
So this can be for both of you or either one of you. So is the solution to this rampant voter suppression through all these different avenues, especially in places like Georgia, Michigan, where I'm from originally, Wisconsin, as you just mentioned, coupled with anti-blackness and the fear of Blacks in power. By power, I mean a Black president, but also Black voters actually willing to stand in line for 11 hours to get their ballots in. Okay, so are you saying the one thing that definitely can cut through all of that is just still show up in massive numbers? Because I'm asking this because I'm really looking for hope as we're leading into the the midterm elections.
Yeah, and so it is showing up. And it is, and I really firmly believe this. I know, as Ian says, my work looks into the abyss, but
it doesn't look into the abyss. It drags the abyss up and lays it out in front of us.
But I really believe that there's this really vocal, nasty, vitriolic component in American society. But the vast number of Americans don't want that. They want the thing to work. And so if we provide the education and the tools and the mechanisms for it to work, if we lay it out for them, what's really happening, if we make the illegible legible and provide pathways to having the kind of democracy we deserve, then it can happen. And so that's why I'm just so thankful for Book Passage for this, to be able to have this conversation and to know that a better future is possible. We have to do the work. One of the lines that I have in White Rage is imagine, and that we have the power to overcome, to subvert white rage, to render it powerless by not succumbing to the dog whistles that stoke the fear, by living in our imaginations about how this could really work. Woo! Woo!
Yeah.
I
I mean, but keep in mind, Ian, you probably feel this way, that in California, we're kind of in a bit of a liberal bubble here.
Oh, I think we have so much work to do. Let me add to what Carol's saying, because when she says do the work, let me be clear. For a lot of the audience, the work is the reading. The work is, I'm gonna hold this book up, right? And now this work is partly find out what anti-blackness has done to Black communities, but it is also find out what anti-blackness is doing to America, right? Like, this is a story of the Koch brothers, the Heritage Foundation, Paul Weyrich, the Republican Party. Yes, they govern through violence against the African-American community. They also govern through massive tax cuts for corporations by a refusal to rein in petrochemical industries, by an anti-democratic commitment that prefers power over democracy. This story, this work, this education is what will set us free. Not just Black people, all of us,
Right.
all of us.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, no,
Yes, Carol, love the book.
great point. Yeah, and keep in mind, one person, no vote, and merge left, Ian's book.
Yay.
Both in paperback. We have them in abundance at Book Passage. No reason not to have it, and do the work, learn the work, then do the work. And one of the points I wanted to bring up with the liberal bubble thing was that now that we're all in a virtual world and we can kind of reach out all over the place and it's become commonplace, is you can help out in other states that really need help with maybe postcards or phone calls, or maybe you can't afford to maybe go there. You don't have the time or the money to fly there. But now there's so many organizations that are just asking for help in ways that distance doesn't make a difference. And I think that's part of the work too,
It really is. It really is. It's doing the work with these organizations. It's also doing the work for candidates whose value systems and policies are really about us and not about the Herrenvolk democracy. It is really about, having real climate change policy. It is about having real environmental justice. It is about having real criminal justice reform. It is about finding, raising the minimum wage to a living wage. It is about all of those things that keep us healthy and strong and vibrant. There are candidates out there where that is their vision. Find them, work with them, support them. We do that work. Woo.
Can I just say, I love Stacey Abrams too?
Yes, Stacey. I forgot, I usually have a Stacey Abrams candle. I had it lit for this discussion. Thank you two so much. I mean, these are two very busy professors and sought after to speak and write. And we really consider it such an honor and a privilege to have you on the Book Passage stage, whether it's in person or virtually. Thank you, Ian, for heeding the call again from me to help me with this Race in America, not panel, but event. It means so much, and it will live forever on our YouTube channel and on the Book Passage channel. So people, call us, come by the store safely in San Francisco or Corte Madera, and you can get all of Carol's books, all of Ian's books, read the books, then do the work. Thank you to Can't Thank You Enough. And thank you, audience. Please like and subscribe our channel. Please come by and buy our books and support these wonderful authors. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you.
It's been an honor.
Wonderful.